everybody, this is the biggest project we have got yet. Today we have in the garage the Toyota, and what we're going to be doing is the FRS forged clutch fork, billet pivot, and we've got the ACT clutch kit here. And this is the street clutch, the full face street clutch, which will be this because we know my clutch has been slipping and slowly falling apart, and the lightweight flywheel. Now, the book says this job is, I think it was 3 hours, 4 hours. A lot of people on the forums say it takes them anywhere between 2 hours and 9 hours. So I'm not going to be surprised at all if this ends up taking me today and tomorrow, because every single time I have a 10 to 20 minute job, it ends up taking me a few hours. So I'd like to think that I could get this done in 3 to 4 hours because it's supposed to be pretty simple. In fact, the hardest parts can actually be just undoing all the bolts. I'm going to do a lot of nut twisting. But I guess we're going to find out. So oddly enough, to start this work under the car, we've got to start inside the car. We've got to remove the console, we've got to remove the shifter. Then we've got to remove all of the splash shields and dust pans, all the underbody panels. We've got to drop 2 sections of exhaust. We've got to remove the drive shaft, the transmission cradle. We've got to disconnect the wires on top of the transmission. We've got to disconnect the starter. We've got to disconnect the where the pivot is for the clutch. We've got to unbolt that from the transmission, and it's all pretty straightforward, but it's a lot of bolts and it's a lot to do, and I'm a nervous, crazy person. I'm really afraid that I'm going to mess something up, but we're going to give this a try anyway. So let me get some screwdrivers and stuff out. We're going to get in the car, we're going to pop the console and everything off, remove the shifter first. First things first, little shot of Reaction Motorsports events there. Any of you local people that want to autocross. I never can seem to get this out when I'm on camera, but there. So we're going to remove that stuff real quick. We've got 2 10mm bolts right here. We're going to loosen those, get those out. We need to pull this loose for the parking brake. Got to take our shift knob off. Most of you have probably done most of this stuff before to paint the trim. Take this off. Gotta pull the boot off, make it a little bit easier here. Disconnect our plug for traction here. Okay, get that out of the way. Now we've got 2 Phillips screws here, and get our little lucky cat here. Gonna pull him off, put him over here too. And the little cubby pocket is usually easiest to get out if you reach around underneath, but lighting is never what I need it to be. You can actually get to it easier this way because these have to come off anyway. There's that one. There's the mate over here, but you can reach up under here to push the little cubby out there. See if I can get that hung up again. Okay. Not okay. Bear with me, please. All right. So that can come out. We're going to set that aside, and here's the 2 other screws. So you're going to get these two, and these 2 bolts, and then the console is going to lift up, and I'm just going to pick it up and just set it straight back, because what we need is to get here. And I have another video about how I removed all this to change my shifter out, but since this is such a big project, I'm going to film everything. So after we get the console pulled out, we're going to have to remove the little, I guess this is a sound deadener that they have around here. We're going to remove that, and then we can start to look at the actual mechanism for the shifter, and we've got to pull this up out of there anyway. So let me get the console lifted out real quick, and be sure to mind the electrical plug behind here for this, and we will cut back to actually getting here. Okay, so we pulled the console off, and there's these little white clips that hold the sound deadener on, whatever you want to call it. So now that that's off, now we got to get to these bolts here that hold this plate on, that holds the shift boot on. I believe those are 12mm. So we're going to pull these 4 bolts off real quick, and we're going to lift the shift boot off now. So now that that's going to lift off, and we've got this little wire tender here. Poke that off. Now this is a different shifter than what's stock, so I'm going to have to force that off there a little bit more than you're going to have to. Set that down out of the way. So here's the shifter. Now, there's a little shift boot here that has a clip on it. We need to remove that to actually move it from the linkage. So we're going to pull the shift boot off, and you have to be careful not to rip it. It's very tight fitting. That's what she said. And get it off. And so I can concentrate a little bit better, and I don't rip mine any more than I already have in the past. I'm going to go ahead and cut back after I get the boot off, and I'm going to go in closer so you can actually see the pin. So here's the pin right here, and it's not hard to get off, but you just have to be careful that you don't lose it, like I'm liable to do if I don't bump the camera and knock it on the floor already. I was supposed to do all this yesterday, and ended up getting called into work, and I didn't have time. So there's the clip, as you can see it. Put that in our interior car parts tray, and adjust this camera so you guys don't fall off of here. Bear with me, people. Okay. Now there's a washer on there as well, along with grease. Do this as carefully as I can so I don't lose anything here. Of course, it's going to fight me like everything does. I'm going to have to get a screwdriver, but we need to remove this washer, and then the actual shaft should pull out through the bottom of the shifter, and that will be all there is to it to disconnect the shifter. And I don't actually think we're going to have to remove the entire shifter from the car. I don't really see why we would have to, as long as we disconnect it from the transmission. So that's what we're going to do. Pull off this washer here, and that shaft is going to push out, and that will be all there is to it to do inside the car, which means when we cut back, we're going to be under the car, and we're going to start removing some of the underbody panels, the exhaust, and the drive shaft. Okay, so the first panel we're going to move is this front one up here, and pretty much if you've ever done anything on these cars, this has to come off, especially if you've done the header, and if you're upgrading clutch, you've most likely done a header. So it's mostly these 12mm bolts across the back, and then we got the big heavy duty push pins up the side and some more bolts up front. So it's actually really cut and dried. It's just some very simple things to do. Make sure you have a bolt can to keep everything separated, especially on a project this large. So I'm going to get this one off, and then we're going to look at removing this next one, and it's just about as easy. There's just some bolts around the back, so you guys can see here. There's some bolts along the back here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the back. There's nothing up the side that I feel anyway. and the front's actually held on by the bolts of the front panel. So both of these come off really quick. We're going to get these off, and I'm just going to throw them back to the back of the car. And then we are going to look at removing the front pipe and the first section of the catback. And for mine with the MagnaFlow, shouldn't be too difficult. I really would rather not have to remove it off that rear hanger back there, but I'm probably going to have to. So we'll get there when we get there. Let me get these panels off and remove the front pipe, and we'll come back from there. So I got the pans off. They were really easy. So now we can actually see the bottom of the car, and it's actually going to be easy to work on because this is the bell housing that we're going to be unbolting right up here. So it's not going to be hard. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to remove the exhaust. So the front pipe bolts on right here. It's just 2 bolts, and this is an aftermarket front pipe. And then there's another bolt back here that holds it. And then here's the flex joint. My camera angle sucks, I'm sorry. Here's the flex joint. And then my cat back, thank you Daniel, comes back to here. I have to quote my dad about a freaking drop light here. Probably giving y'all a headache with all this going around in circles under here. So the thing I'm actually concerned about, there we go, now you're oriented correctly. I hate exhaust mounts, the hangers. I hate them. They hurt my hands every time I try to take them off. Shout out to Toyota for actually putting something into this car other than Subaru. I would really like to not have to remove that exhaust hanger, but it's probably going to be best to get it out of the way and just get it pulled off and not have to worry about it, which is what I'm probably going to end up doing. So I'm going to probably take that off first, or at least get that started to come off so there's not weight hanging on it. And then I've just got one slip joint back here. Stock, I think the stock exhaust is 2 bolts for the back, but that's really all there is to it for this part. And we're going to have the exhaust dropped off of here. And once the exhaust is off, then we're going to be, there we go, right here. So this is actually where the drive line is, and it's not hard to get off. It slips into the back of the transmission there. We've got the carrier bearing is up here, and it looks like that's just 2 bolts holding it to the chassis of the car. And then there's 4 bolts at the yoke at the differential. It all comes off really easy. The only thing you got to do before you pull out the drive shaft, we have got to drain the oil out of the transmission. Pretty sure it's this plug right here, because I'm pretty sure that this is the fill one. I'm going to double check that on the Google before I start just willy-nilly taking stuff out. I'm hoping that's the fill one, because if it is, it won't be that difficult for me to refill the transmission with some modal from above, because I have a funnel and a hose like I did in my Mazda. So that should be how that works. So I'm going to remove the exhaust first. Oh, pray for my hands. And then I'm going to drain the transmission. And I will cut back and we'll take a closer look at removing the drive line. Okay, I got the front pipe off. And I didn't take off the back of the catback because I honestly lost patience with dealing with the exhaust hanger. So to help support the weight, I just hung a wire up there and went around the exhaust. Sorry about the glare. And we still should be able to move this around enough where we can get to these bolts for the carrier bearing on the drive shaft. So our next step is to actually drain the transmission, and it's a 10mm hex socket. That is the drain right here, and this is the fill right up here. Sorry. So we're gonna drain this really quick. Hopefully the oil doesn't look too bad. I'm kind of curious about it. I'm really curious to see what the modal is gonna do as far as shifting. And then we're gonna go back there and take off the drive line. And then we'll be ready to start unbolting this transmission. Well, it doesn't look too bad. It's, as you can see, still draining. But can see some medical particles on here. And I would be assuming that this was the original transmission fluid. This car has 71,000 or something, just over 70,000 miles on it. And other than the springs and stuff on it, and there was some audio equipment in it, I'm pretty sure this car was mostly stock, and I don't think this was ever changed. But like I said, the fluid's still clear. It's not too nasty. But I'm gonna let it finish draining, and I wanted to show the fluid on here, but it's not bad. So I highly suggest when you put the drain plug back in, you torque it, and I'm gonna have to Google the torque specs on it. I should have when I was making sure that this was the drain plug, but I highly suggest torquing this back in there because we will not be removing it again, and it's best to put stuff back properly as opposed to finger tight and forget about it and then have it fall out while you're going down the road. So what we're looking for is 27 foot-pounds. I've already set my torque wrench. There we go. You know, I try to look as cool as I can on camera, and I always end up looking like an idiot who doesn't know what they're doing. So, like I say in any video where we change a fluid, even though we're not done yet, and we are going to do the differential before this is done, by the way. I'm going to wipe off what little drip we have here, and any time you touch something that has fluid in it, especially engine oil or transmission, whatever, always be checking under your car for drips. Just make sure that everything got put back on there right. If you check something 4 times, odds are you've got it. So I'm going to wipe this off, and then we're going to go that way, and we're going to start looking at removing this driveline. On we go. So the driveline. Now the front, we don't have to do anything up there. That just slips out of the back of the transmission, the tail housing. So up here for the carrier, these are just two 14mm bolts that hold the carrier. And I've got the big ugly 1/2-inch drive to get those in case they're in there harder than I think they will be. And these 4 bolts right here on the rear yoke for the driveline. Now, I've read in some places they say to hammer on the U-joint if it's stuck on there, and I highly suggest against that because that's a different type of wear and tear on the needle bearings in here, and you don't want to cause those to go out. They're already fighting everything else, being this low to the ground and being the one that has the majority of the wear and tear. So we're gonna not hammer on that. Usually if these are stuck, you can get a screwdriver or a pry bar right here in this recess, and you can pry against this to get it loose. But these are also 14mm, so I'm going to loosen all of these, take 2 of them out. I'm going to loosen the carrier bearing up front. Then I'm going to finish taking this out, and we're going to drop this all the way to the ground and set it aside with the rest of the exhaust. So it's only 6 bolts, and it shouldn't take long. But like I said, don't forget to drain the transmission, because if you don't, all of the fluid is going to come out of the tail housing right there on top of you. So, one other little edit. As I was under here playing and looking at the car, I noticed that the housing that holds the shifter right here, well, that's actually going to stay on the transmission, because I'm an idiot, didn't know that. So I just got up in the car, 4 10mm bolts, and pulled the shifter up out of there, which is not what I did earlier in the video, but I've fixed it and I've taken it out of the car and set it aside on the workbench. So now all of this can come out, because everything you see here is actually on the transmission. And I was reading elsewhere, and I'm going to condemn myself already because I'm probably wrong, but I was reading that they remove these 4 bolts for the transmission, and then these 2 for the transmission, then these 4. And I think that's really unnecessary. These 4 bolts hold this entire carriage right here, and we can just take these 4 out and unless you're replacing this bushing, which I'm not, there's no, or the mount, there's no reason to take out all these other bolts that I read on the forum. Like, I can't see the necessity. However, if I'm wrong, I will admit it as soon as we get there. So let me pull the 6 bolts and get the drive line out. Alright, so the drive line is out. Everything I tried to get the back yoke off back here failed. Mine is a Kansas car. I could not get it to come off. I put a small screw jack on it and jacked up on it and beat on the sides of it with a hammer. It will not come off. Mine rusted on. I finally got pissed off and decided to stop screwing with it, so I separate. You know, I can't give you guys light when you need it, and I can't get away from it when you don't. I separated the yoke right there from the cradle, where the you know, now I can't remember, I've said it 3 times, where the carrier bearing is there. So the drive shaft is now out as much as it needs to be. To remove the transmission, so now we can actually get on to the rest of this. Now, we are going to have to support the front of the engine up here. People say they can just support it on the oil pan because we just got to keep it from tipping forward. So it shouldn't be that big of a deal up here. I can see a pretty good spot right here. That's just part of the block. So I can probably put a piece of wood right there and a small screw jack just to support the engine. So we're going to go up top now, and we're going to disconnect the wires. We're going to disconnect where the pivot goes, and we're going to loosen all the bolts along the top and the starter here, so we can just remove the starter out of here. It's not big, it's not heavy, it won't be that big of a deal, and it'll be a little bit more room for us to move under here. So we're going to go to the top of the car now and do all of that on top. And when we get back under here, we're going to remove the side bolts and the ones under here, and then the back cradle. Now I'm going to get my floor jack under here to support the transmission. I think the balancing, they said the balancing point is somewhere right along here. It's actually further back than you would think because of where the gear set is, because this is just the bell housing up here and the clutch is right there. So the gear set is actually between here and here. So I'm pretty sure that this is the balancing point. But anyway, I'm going to get a small piece of wood so it'll be easier to get the balancing point. We're going to pick up on it right here with my floor jack. And when we get everything loose, the transmission is actually going to come back about 3 inches to clear the sway bar and the steering rack. But other than that, this thing's ready to come out, so let's go up top. Okay, now we're on top of the car. These 2 connectors right here, there's a gray one and a red one. These both need disconnected. This ground right here needs disconnected. And on the clutch actuator, there's these 2 bolts that actually hold it to the transmission. And we're going to unbolt those and just remove this off top of the transmission instead of disconnecting the line, because I don't want to have to be bleeding the clutch. So we're going to take these 2 bolts off, take this loose, the ground, and these 2 wires. Now to the starter, always disconnect the battery. I have them both off because I was messing around with some of the things. So to actually finish removing the starter, there's this rubber boot here, and under that's a bolt, and we got to remove that, and we actually got to take the wires off the starter itself, which again is not going to be a big deal. So I haven't decided yet whether it's going to be easier for me to get to this underneath the car, but I think it'll be okay for the top. So we're going to disconnect these wires on the starter, the ground, these 2 cables, and then these 2 bolts on the actuator. And we'll go back from there. Now that all the wires are disconnected, the pivot actuator, I guess, is off, and the wires on the starter here, so you can see, one of them was a little connector, had a lot of grease on it. The other one was a 12mm nut on the back. It's loose. Now, every one of the bolts can be accessed on the bell housing underneath the car. The only one that you can't see, got a feel for, is the top one on the starter here. But again, I actually reached up with my left arm over the top of the transmission on this side and used my right arm to help guide the socket on. And they're all 14 millimeter. And I just used 1/2 inch drive and an extension. So we can go under the car and finish breaking everything loose in the cradle. And I gotta get my floor jack under the car and get ready to support this thing. Oh, and we need to support the front of the engine, and then we can start to unmarry the transmission. Here's how I supported the engine. Just put a couple pieces of wood right on the front of the block in front of the oil pan, and I just have a small screw jack on some blocks of wood, and it's supporting the engine. I took some weight up on it. So I broke loose all of the bolts. The one that's hidden is up back here. Then there's this one here. There's a bolt here. There's a nut on a stud here. There's another nut on a stud. Bolt, bolt. And there's the bolt up here. So I've got all of these loose. They're all finger tight now. And back here, where the cradle is now starting to hold more of the weight of the transmission. So I am going to loosen these a little bit more. I'm going to get my floor jack under here, and I'm going to put it right there. Probably put another block of wood there and just support it there. Well, it might reach. We'll see. And as soon as I get some of the pressure off this, I'm going to pull all the bolts out, and I'm going to try to actually do this without busting any knuckles. And I might actually try to have you guys on camera while I pull it back. But we'll see. It's only supposed to weigh like 80-something pounds, so it's not that heavy of a transmission. So let me get all these out and loosen the cradle a little bit more and get the jack under here and get this supported. So something to note that I was noticing when I was getting ready for this, these two bolts right here that hold the tail of the, I don't know what you want to call it, the shift tower, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure somebody will tell me. These two bolts need to come out, and that's going to make this a lot easier. I believe they're just a couple more 12s. Pull those out real quick, and then we're going to get on to this. All right, here we go. I'll have to let it down a little bit more in the back. I believe we are free.
It's a little bit more front heavy than I thought it was. Let it down a little bit. I'm still above the sway bar. In the back of the... I'm gonna let it down a little bit here, see if we can muscle it some. Get the handle back down. This would be a lot easier with a little bit more strength. It's still front heavy, it seems. All right. Okay. Make sure all of the wires that you have aren't binding on anything. Everything's disconnected. If something feels like it's not going straight, stop and reassess. You don't want to rip anything off. The transmission may only weigh 86 pounds, but that's heavy enough to rip a wire out. For God's sakes, don't drop it on yourself. Oh, there she is. It is a lot more front heavy than people were saying. I'm gonna have to say the balancing point somewhere about even with the fill plug. And that's it. And whoa, I can see that clutch. Good Lord. Okay, that's it for dropping this thing. I'm going to set it down on the ground and scoot it out from underneath the car, or at least further back, so I can get to that clutch and flywheel a little bit better. If anybody wants to know what a blown throwout bearing looks like, and I didn't even know what was bad, you hear that? That is what a dried out, ruined throwout bearing sounds like. So we're replacing this, the clutch fork, and the pivot behind it. And conversely to this, let's see what a good throwout bearing sounds like. Bear with me for science. A new one. What a wonderful sound that is. So we have to remove these little clips on the side of the clutch fork, and they come off pretty easy. You want to try not to bend them too much, obviously. But they come off pretty easy. And we're going to remove both of those, and then the throwout bearing is going to come off. Then we can change the fork and the pivot. And to remove the fork, simply grab it, twist side to side, and it pulls right out. So there's the fork and there's the pivot. That should be pretty self-explanatory. So I'm actually going to take this fork and the spring clips and everything up to the bench now that I figured out how to take the fork off. And we're going to put the throwout bearing on the fork. So basically all we're going to do now, we've got to take the spring off the back of this. So much clutch debris you can see on there. We've got our new fork. Get some of that off of there. And clip that in like it's supposed to. Put our throwout bearing on here. Let's see if I can get these guessed about right here. And I did not. mercy sakes, people. What is my deal? This is not that difficult. I'm just an idiot, apparently, and can't seem to figure this out. Why on earth? It doesn't go down that far, does it? Maybe it does. This doesn't look right. It doesn't look right at all to me, but maybe it is. I'm gonna go set this on the transmission. I believe that's how it's supposed to go on there. Let's go see. If I'm gonna be an idiot, we may as well all see it together. Yes, I know I haven't put the pivot on there yet. Yeah, that's it. That's how it goes on there, just like we have on there. So, yeah. All right, let me change the pivot and get some grease on the shaft, and this will be ready to go back in the car, but we still have to get to the clutch. So for the pivot, it's just a 19 millimeter. Put the good one back in here. Alright, now I have greased the back of the clutch fork where the pivot's going to be, but I'm also going to put a little bit more grease on there too, just so it's well lubricated. I'm going to get a little bit on the shaft here. I need to wipe that off, so I'm going to get a rag and wipe that off and put a little bit of grease on the shaft. And I'll just take you over here with me really quick. And I made sure to put a lot of grease where the throwout bearing rests against the clutch fork, and there's the grease there. So now that that's all done, we're basically ready to put this back on the transmission, and we can get to that. So when you torque the, well, Jared, when you torque the clutch pivot, it's just 12 pounds, which we are at. Then, hold on, let me get this back down. Okay, for our last little bit of grease here. Don't forget some on the pivot ball. Don't forget we still have plenty on the back of our actual fork, so up through the rubber, that's what she said. On there. There we go. And there is our new throwout bearing, clutch fork, and pivot from BRZ Engineering. Make sure it's riding smoothly. It looks good to me. Alright, let's get back onto the car and get that new clutch in there. Here is the flywheel with the clutch and pressure plate removed. The clutch was a joke. It was so bad, and you can see, if I get out of the light, how bad the flywheel looks. I'm really glad I ended up just ordering a new one, because the clutch was gone, and you can see the wear marks in it. It was really bad. So I wanted to show how I binded the flywheel to get the bolts off. Now I have a spare piece of aluminum 1-inch angle, and I just put it here in the teeth like this, and I use that to hold the flywheel from turning while I broke these loose. And they're only on there with 60-some foot-pounds of torque. And I'm going to use the bolts that came with the clutch kit with just a little bit of Loctite on them, and I'm going to torque them down to 63. I've already got the clutch under the car with me, as you can see right here, and I've already wiped the mating surface off. After I get it bolted on, I'm going to do it again before I put the clutch and pressure plate on. But you can, like, look at that. I just cleaned my hands and the clutch dust gets everywhere, so be ready for that. Anyway, I've already broke these loose. I'm going to finish taking these bolts off, get this flywheel off, get the new flywheel on. It has the pilot bearing already on it, and behind the flywheel is actually a I think it's a timing plate or something to monitor RPMs or something, but it's on there and I don't want to move it. So I'm going to pull this flywheel off and get the other one on and bolt it on. And like I said, that's 63 foot-pounds of torque. So we're going to cut back after the new flywheel is on as we align the clutch plate. And there it is with the new flywheel on, and everything has been torqued. And make sure that you crisscross tighten those to 63 foot-pounds. I'm going to wipe that surface off real quick and grab the clutch disc and the alignment tool and get it set in there. Okay, so I wiped the surface off. I put the clutch disc on the alignment tool, and ACT was nice enough. They even wrote transmission side on the clutch disc, so dummies like me get it correct. So that's on there and aligned where it needs to be. So now what I got to do is go get the pressure plate, wipe that surface down one more time, and we're going to align it on these 3 dowels right here. 2, hold on, not low enough, 2, and then 3 is up here, not touch the clutch, Jared. And gonna bring the bolts down here, bolt the pressure plate on, I guess. I think that's where we're at. Went over everything 3 times in my head. I torqued it 3 times around to make sure everything was right. A drop of Loctite on all the bolts. I didn't touch the disc behind the flywheel. I took it off and immediately put the new one on. It's been wiped down. The dowels are in it. All the serial numbers and part numbers were correct. Disc is on. Alignment tool is in. Let me get the pressure plate and the bolts. And there's the pressure plate installed. The 6 bolts are 25 to 26 foot-pounds of torque with no Loctite. I put them on with 26 and then just a smidgen more. But it pulled the pressure plate down nicely along the flywheel onto the dowels. Everything is aligned good. I'm going to leave that in for today. I think I'm done with this for tonight. So if there's a continuity problem, like I've got a different looking shirt on tomorrow, that's why. I don't feel like wrestling the transmission around. I have a week off, so I can just do this at my leisure and take my time. I'm going to go and enjoy the rest of my evening and let this car sit as it sits for the remainder of the night. And we're going to get back on it tomorrow morning and start getting the transmission lined up to go back up in here. I do believe that is the next task. We've got to put a little bit of grease on the input shaft. So where it goes into the clutch disc there where the alignment tool is. ACT supplied that for us, sitting down here next to me. And I'm pretty sure that we're ready to put that back in. The clutch fork is on, the pivot is on, everything is torqued down and greased. I think that is the next step, is to drag the transmission back under here and get it lined up and set it back on, and then the rest of this should be pretty simple. I think lining the transmission up and getting it back up on there where it needs to be is going to be the more difficult part for tomorrow. But other than that, we are over halfway done and we are on our way back together and seeing if we have less clutch slippage than we've been having. So we are beginning to put the transmission back in, and ACT supplied us, let me get the tube so we can see what we're talking about here. ACT supplied us with some high temp grease and put a very thin amount on the input shaft, and I made sure to smear it around. We don't want any of that flinging around on the clutch face or anything like that. So I got to make sure that that's on there. I've taken the alignment tool out of the clutch basket, and we are going to put this transmission into fourth gear, so if I can reach into the tail housing of the transmission and turn the shaft to help align the splines going back in the engine. So the only hard part for this end of the project is going to be getting the transmission lined back up and put back in place. So I'm going to pull the transmission back up on top of the jack, and we're going to get it lifted up into place and see about getting it slotted in. With a little bit of careful maneuvering, and I do suggest making sure the transmission is as level as possible, you can wiggle it on, and if it doesn't just slip right on, something is in the way. Be sure to check on the top that none of the wires fell into place. You have to make sure that the input shaft is aligned with the crank so everything slips into the splines like it's supposed to. You do not want to nick anything or bend anything. Took me about 10 minutes of careful finagling to get everything in its place, and I started all the bolts and ran them down finger tight, and that includes the starter up here. All this goes off or goes back together just as easily as it came off. I didn't really have any issues that needs addressed. Everything was pretty straightforward putting it back in there. I have been looking for the torque specs, and I've read, I think it was 26 foot-pounds for the bolts and 33 foot-pounds for these two nuts on the bottom. But I want to check that some more on Google before I get my torque wrench out and start torquing things down, because that doesn't sound tight enough. But I'm going to get the torque wrench out anyway and get a socket and do a little bit more Googling, and we're going to start torquing these down. When I come back, I will actually tell you what I torqued them down to, and hopefully that will be enough, but we will see. So it ended up being these bolts were 26 foot-pounds and the nuts on the bottom were 33 foot-pounds. I want to make sure we get all these tight. There's the 3 bolts here and the northern friend up there, the 2 nuts along the bottom, and then there's that bolt there, and then there's the 2 on the starter. After that, we did the cradle, and I did these a little bit more snug than that. I got bored looking for torque specs, and these are, well, you're probably not going to be able to strip these. And I had my 1/2-inch drive, so I put those on pretty snug. Then there's the 2 up here that hold the back of the shifter housing, I don't know, whatever you want to call that. And now we're going to basically go on to reassembly. We have this ground wire that goes on the starter bracket up here, and we're going to go on top of the car, and we're going to put, see if I can manipulate my hands here. We have this connector that's going to go back on the starter, and the power wire that goes on the starter, and then there's the 2 plugs on the top of the transmission and the clutch push rod actuator that needs bolted back down. So we're going to button everything up top there, and then we're going to come back here. We're going to put the drive line in and get that remounted back up in here the way it's supposed to be, which includes our center bearing here. And then we can start looking at filling this baby up with some nice fresh modal. So up top, we want to make sure that the actuator is back on right here, and I greased this part of the pivot where we put the new fork on. I want to make sure the gray and the red plugs are back in, the ground is back on, and we've rehooked the top, the starter, this trigger wire that we were talking about, and the power wire. Now as far as up here, we should be done, other than of course rehooking the battery. So what's left is really under the car. We need to finish putting the drive shaft back up. We've got to get the exhaust back on, and then we're going to start it up after we put the shifter back in and make sure we can get in all the gears and everything's functioning the way it needs to be. But we cannot forget the transmission fluid, which I have sitting on top of my keys so I don't forget about it. So let's get a hold of the drive shaft and get it in, and we'll probably, I guess, refill the transmission with fluid first. So we got the drive line in. It is in fact splined, so be very careful and rotate it slowly till it splines back in. You do not want to mess up the rear seal on the transmission. So we got that back in. We've got the center bearing bolted back in, and we've put the driveline bolts back in. Make sure that they're all torqued nice and tight, since I took my back ones out as well when I was fighting with the back of the drive shaft that I never got off. I also put those back on and tightened them where they need to be as well. So our next step that we're going to be doing here now, if I find the right side of the car, is we are going to be putting the fluid in now. We're going to remove our plug, and I have a funnel and hose I'm going to be using to fill this from the top. So let me get up top and get a hose and stick in here and stick my funnel up the top there so I can fill this up. And I believe it calls for 2.2 liters of fluid, but I'm going to double check that before I start pouring it in here. And ideally what you want to do is you want to put it in until it just starts to run out of this hole, or you can stick your pinky in there or another appendage of yours that if you might be able to fit, and just feel the fluid level with that hole. So let me get up top, get a filter and hose, and start filling this baby up. So as it turns out, the old ways are not always best. These transmissions hold 2.2 quarts, and that comes from not only Toyota but every other single thing I could find on the internet. In which case you can't feel the fluid with your finger going in there like I'm so used to doing on all of my older trucks and stuff. So I guess it's time to stop harking onto the past. So anyway, I've got 2.2 quarts in, and these fill plugs are the same at 27 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, so that's it for the transmission. Everything's connected, starter's connected, everything's torqued on. Driveline is in, fluid is in. So I guess what we're going to do now is we're going to put the front pipe on the exhaust, get the exhaust bolted back up where it needs to be, and then we're going to put the shifter in. And we're going to go ahead and, while it's stationary on all these jack stands and it's nice and good, I'm going to take my wheels off and I'm going to take them down the road and have the tires flipped on them so I get better tread wear. I'm going to start it up with it on the jack stands, make sure everything functions the way it needs to. I'm still a little nervous about that, but we'll see. Make sure everything functions the way it's supposed to. It'll go in and out of gear, the clutch will disengage, etc. And after we run that quick check, I'm going to go ahead and change the fluid in the differential, and I have to service the engine while it's up here anyway, but we're not going to put that on the video because we've already done that. But I am going to have you guys on the differential fluid change because it's pertinent for what we're doing. So, front pipe, shifter, we're going to start it up, make sure everything's working properly. Then we're going to service the differential. I'm going to service the engine. And if everything is okay, we're going to start putting body panels back on this. And hopefully we will have it on the ground drivable within the next couple hours. And we can start breaking in that clutch. Okay, so now that we've got the front pipe in, don't forget your gaskets. Never seize the bolts. We've got this main hanger up here that's now put back in. And the slip joint, not a slip joint, the, what do you call these? It's the little ball joint. This is the one that has the exhaust donut. Flex joint or whatever they call it. I'm sure someone will correct it. That's all on there, and I tightened the actual slip joint at the back where my muffler is, where I loosened it. So now that this is all on, what I'm gonna do, is put the shifter in, and then we're gonna start it up and see what it'll do. Okay, so we put the shifter back in. The more difficult part was actually getting the rod into the bottom of the shifter, but for the OEM shifter, I don't think it'll be quite as difficult. And I had to readjust my reverse lockout, so make sure that you readjust yours as well, so you can still shift smooth between gears, and you can still get yours. And I've already put it in all the gears, and everything feels okay. And I just reconnected the battery, so before I put anything else together, I'm going to get the keys, cross my fingers, and start it up. All right. I can feel it going into gear. Wheels aren't turning. Clutch out. Nothing's turning. First gear. Keep in mind that we are in fact on jack stands. First gear. Slowly gonna let the clutch out. Working there. Back to neutral. Clutch out in neutral, foot on the brake. Foot off the brake, wheels turn slowly as you would expect with cold fluid, etc. Okay, I guess we're going to, oh that's cute, look at that. See the drive line turning. That's foot on the brake, foot off the brake. I guess we're gonna call it okay, and I'm going to pull the wheels off this thing and take them down the shop to the Big O tire and have them flip my tires around so I get better tread wear. And when I get back and put them back on, then we're going to start putting all this together. And by that time, everything should have cooled down, and I'm going to drain the differential, and we'll do that as well. Well, I just got back with the tires, and apparently that tire can't be changed. So, we will just stick those back on there and drive carefully for the foreseeable future until I can afford new tires. So, the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of grease right here where my reverse lockout is so it doesn't wear the lockout mechanism itself. Put a little bit of grease on there, and then we try not to make a mess in this car. We'll be putting the shift boot back on and the sound deadener here. And all of this should be pretty rudimentary. We've got 4 bolts, then the 2 white plugs that go on there, and then we will actually put the center console back in, and the trim panels on the sides, the little cubby, and then our other trim pieces. And don't forget to reconnect your traction buttons and your cigarette lighter AC port, so power port, whatever you want to call it. All right, so there we go. Let me go get some grease and get this put back together. So as we wrap this to a close, we're gonna, like I said earlier, we're going to do the diff as well. Since we're putting modal in the transmission, we're also going to put it in the drive differential back here. Oh, she's tight. I've already looked up the torque specs on this. It needs to be 36 foot-pounds of torque when we put it back. But we're going to go ahead and drain it and see what it looks like, if I can try not to make a giant mess back here. And by the looks of things, it's not even, ignore my phone back there. By the looks of things, it's not going to be too big of a deal to even put the fluid back in this, because the modal bottles have a nice little little nose on them. It shouldn't be too big of a deal to get them right in here. This is the fill plug to refill this thing. Make sure I get that in there all the way. I don't want to have to do this here. We didn't come this far to mess it up. Oh man, is it on there? Really don't want to break anything. Ah, there she comes. Okay. There we go. Let it bring some air in. So, everybody recommends doing this, whether you do anything in the transmission or not. Most people recommend doing this for the transmission and the differential regardless of anything. It's supposed to help the gears in both shift better and run smoother, so that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to let that finish draining. And I'm going to get some rags and stuff to clean up the mess. And I've already got the torque wrench set for 36 pounds to go back. And as soon as this is done, we're actually going to be putting these underbody panels back on and getting this thing put on the ground. I still got to put my wheels back on. They're still in the back of my Mazda from the shop. And I had lunch, so needed my McDonald's greasy food. So anyway, let me get a rag and wipe off the magnetic nipple on that plug, and we're going to fill this baby back up with 1.1 to 1.2 liters, I think is what it calls for. I think it's 1.1 to 1.2. Anyway, as soon as it gets done draining, put the plug back in, 36 foot-pounds, and then 1.1 to 1.2 liters of fluid back in this, and torque that down to 36 foot-pounds. And then we're going to go back up front and start putting these underbody panels on. And that's it. The underbody panels go up just as easy as they come off. I can't stress this enough, and I know everybody's sick of hearing about it. Please never seize the bolts under here. I still had some on from the front, this back panel, and the bolts that held it up. Please never seize on these things so they don't get locked up in there and rusted in, especially if you live in a northern state where you use a lot of salt on the roads during the winter times. I'm lucky in the south and we don't have that very often, but it's still a good practice to get into, especially for things like this that are always in the elements when you're running down the road. All that's left really is putting this thing back on the ground. I've already serviced it. All that's left is putting it back on the ground and actually taking it for a run out on the roads and seeing what it's like. I've never driven a car with a lightweight flywheel before, so it's going to be interesting. I mean, there's not a lot else to say. Just be very methodical as you go through this process if it's your first time. After I've done it now, I don't think I'll have a problem repeating the steps, and it'll probably take me 2 or 3 hours less to do it. Now that I've done it once before and I know what to look out for and how to do it without fumbling around like an idiot. So that's pretty much it. The next shot will be in the car and reaction on the driving and how the clutch pedal feels with this clutch and with the lightweight flywheel in it. Okay. I literally backed it out. Oh my god. I'm freaking out, man. It feels weird. Everything feels weird. The clutch is heavier. Like I can feel that it's heavier. I'm trying not to be a baby about it. I am super freaking nervous and scared that something is wrong. But disengagement feels like it needs to. Engagement feels like it needs to. It feels okay. Everything feels okay. No check engine lights, no engine oil lights. Everything seems to be okay. I'm still freaking out a little bit. The clutch feels so much nicer right now. I can feel it. and the engine dies down a lot, noticeably quicker. I'm sorry, I'm so nervous. It's noticeably quicker when you put the clutch in. The revs die down with the flywheel. Like it goes down. I mean, you'd expect that, of course, but still. I haven't gone over 25 miles an hour yet. I'm not gonna do a pull because there's a 500-mile break-in, and I understand that. However, it feels nice. It feels nice, very drivable. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna have to learn to drive it all over again. I'm so nervous. Something's wrong. I'm so nervous. Something is wrong. I'm such a baby. It feels good though. Everything feels good. It's a very livable clutch. Of course, it's a full face street clutch, but it's not too stiff, but I can feel it. It's definitely stiffer than it was. But after seeing how worn out the stock clutch was, I'm not surprised. I don't know what an OEM clutch should probably feel like. Mine was so bad. This one, it feels good, okay? And this is the ACT HD Street Clutch. Lightweight flywheel, and it feels fine. It feels good. I mean, I don't have anything negative to say about it. I don't have any idle. Get on your... Move over! Good frickin' Lord, idiot people. Some of us are trying to enjoy ourselves. Driving like an idiot. Okay. I'm trying to wrap this up. Get to a straightaway here so I can kind of get on it a little bit. Then I've got to go back. I left my dog out in my house, and I'm so nervous. Alright. It's actually the first time y'all can hear the new exhaust, too. That's 50. 60. It's good. 65. Feels good. Feels good. I don't think it'll take as much getting used to as I thought, because it's still, it drives more like my Mazda does, and that clutch is worn out, but it's still more stiff than, say, than this one is, or it's not as stiff as this one is, because it's a totally stock clutch, and it's getting worn out. However, it feels good. Engages quick. Feels good, guys. Lady. Thank you, Kevin Kett. Thank you, FT86 Club. All of you people. I've been nervous about this for months, about doing this job. Nervous to death about it. Because I've read all these, oh, well, it won't engage. I can't get the transmission to engage. It won't come out of gear. It won't go into gear. It won't do this. It won't do that. It does this, and everybody has all these problems. And I'm not saying that they did something wrong. I am saying that so far, it doesn't seem like I've done anything wrong. Nice. Oh, this is a good clutch. I'm a fan. I am a fan. Thank you for watching. Job well done.
Behind me, you'll see a car.